Good afternoon, everyone. Well, first of all, I really appreciate you coming. So it's a funny thing that I came in almost an hour early, and there is technical problems that prevent me to see my presenter note here. So basically means that I pretty much lost my presenter notes. So I will probably just try to go through this presentation just without looking at my note, but I have some backup here, and then I hope you don't mind that if sometimes that I come down and look at my phone, then it doesn't bother you. So first of all, I would like to ask you quick questions. How many of you have participated in my session before? Oh, not that many. So that means that most of you are new to my session. Well, thank you very much for coming. So let me just quickly do an introduction of myself. My name is Chi. I am the principal designer at FileMaker. I've been with FileMaker for about 6 years, and this is my 7th DEF CON, and I have been presenting in the past few years, and then specifically talking about design. And I covered different areas in the past, including design process, mobile applications, usability testings, prototype. The interesting thing is that I got a common feedback from the audience that they want more examples. They want solutions. So I have been a little resistant to that myself because I have been in this industry for over a decade, probably 15 or 18 years. So the problem space that we're dealing with is actually a lot more complex. So when we're talking about user experience design, it's really not just about what you see on the screen. There is a huge area. So when I started out my career, there's no such a term called UX, and there is just a term called interaction design, interface design, graphic designs, and UX design comes in, and things start getting mixed up, and people don't really know what is what anymore. So now people don't call it user experience design, they want to call it product designer, and I think it's making the matter worse. So that's why I want to kind of just come back and talk a little bit about the basic element of design, or specifically speaking, graphical user interface for software design. So that's pretty much the topics I would like to talk about today, and I would like to cover the general tools that you can use to tackle the design problem that you have, but not necessarily give you a very specific solution, because those solutions can't be universal enough to apply the majority of use cases you have. So when you're talking about design solution, you really need to talk about the problem space that you're dealing with, which I'll elaborate a little bit more. All right. So first of all, let me quickly introduce myself. The short version for my introduction is that I'm a web person. So I've been in the web industry for more than a decade, and then I started out my career as a producer for advertising agency. I do videos, online games, Flash applications, making music, and then gradually moved to social media platforms. And then a couple years ago, as I joined Yahoo. I came from Yahoo Search. So Yahoo Search is one of the most defining experience that I have in my career, because it pretty much changed the way I think. So here are some examples of my work. So I'm not sure if how many of you have used WebDirect and FileMaker Go. So these are the initial concepts that I created, and some of them got in, some of them not getting in because of scope issues, but this is just to give you a general idea of, let's say, eye candy of the stuff that I've been doing. And for the bottom row, those are iPad applications that I built in FileMaker. So at this point, you probably know that I'm the designer for FileMaker Cloud, and also the designer for the new server administration console. So these two consoles, they look kind of similar, but in terms of the engineering goal and the functionality, they're very, very different. And in FileMaker, our goal, at least I would say that for the design team, the goal that we have within the design team is that we want to provide a reusable component, and also to stabilize the overall user experience across our product. And as you might have know, if you use FileMaker for long, especially in recent years, we start introducing new functionalities. And I feel like there are a lot more products coming out. So there's a point that I feel like things start getting a little spread out because different designers or different teams, they might have a different kind of approach to different design problems. So that's one of the goals that we're trying to do. And it actually takes a little bit of collaborative or like cross-team collaborations, or you call it negotiations, to get some of the design patterns standardized. So I would like to start with my presentation with something like this. So I don't know, how many of you, do you know what is this? Okay, so this is something called Fidget Cube. So this is a toy that's banned at my son's school. I have a 13-year-old son, and I have to say that most of the things that schools bans are really the fun thing. So these fidget spinner, if you get a chance to do a quick Google search, and then you might find a story about interesting Kickstarter programs about this particular toy. If you have never seen this, you have at least heard about fidget spinners. So fidget spinner is something that is meaningless. You put it on your hands and keep your mind occupied. So before fidget spinner, this thing actually came out first. So what this really is that this is really just a combination of series of physical control. And these physical controls are so common that we play with this unconsciously. And it's almost like embedded as our second nature, and we don't really think about it because we don't have to process the function of these buttons. So this is also why that when you see the graphical user interface on screen, and you can instantly relate to the way that we interact with the physical world, and that because you're so familiar with this button, so there is almost like you don't really have to think. So you just go click it, and it turns on, then you dial, and then the lights will dim lighter or darker. So I think this, how do you say, this is I call this a control patterns. So control patterns is really something that you see everywhere in daily life. And you go in your car, you go to kitchens, and even when you're not interacting with the machines, you interact with your daily object, and this kind of control interface comes up all the time. So I call this patterns. Let's introduce another layer to make this a little bit more complicated. As I start to combine this control element, and I start adding colors or adding action, just one or two, it actually creates a sequence. So this sequence creates a story, and it gives meaning to this control interface. So I'm just using this example to show the differences between the US number pad and then Japan number pad, and you can probably instantly recognize what this is. In fact, when I traveled to Japan quite a lot. Probably 5-10 years ago, most of the Japan ATMs, somewhat, my experience is toward the right-hand side. But gradually, over time, as you start to see more banks going internationalized, and there are more foreigners, visitors in Japan, and I start seeing the transactions also become internationalized, and that's when I start to see in Japan's ATM machine, it start to migrate to what we commonly see in US. So this is kind of just an interesting story that I found worthwhile to share. I call this cognitive patterns. And this cognitive patterns is different from the control patterns for this. So this cognitive patterns, over time, it becomes a habit, or it's almost like embedded in your brain. You don't have to think about it. But those two are different things. Control pattern is control patterns. The cognitive pattern is cognitive patterns. So sometimes the cognitive patterns result something that is less than ideal. So I'm just using this TV remote control. I think people can instantly relate to that. So my son actually has quite a lot of problem operating this. He can probably recognize the button at the corners, and the rest of them just takes a lot of time to process, and he would prefer just not to click it. And the time to look at the TV and see what is happening when you click the button, it just takes too long. So he does not want to do it, he just wants to click the button that has colors. So the interesting question is that, in this case, what color? Is it blue or red? So my instinct tells me it's red. But actually, in this case, it's blue. So, this is super awkward. So why this is happening? So this is one of the topics that I want to, the major messages that I would like to convey. Design pattern is not just about user interface. So a lot of cases that I've seen, like young designers or non-designers, so they are talking about user interface design. They focused on the click and the response for, or animated response for your text input, for example, or animated transition between different pages. But I think those are really the technical layers of user interface design. So let me just quickly read through what my definition of design pattern is. It's a cognitive and information process flow. It's a general solution to a recurring design problem. It's a logical sequence that connects an input and output. It has a beginning and an endpoint. This is very important. And it is not necessarily visual. So today I will mostly covering the GUI part because that's the area that I know the most. I can't really say that I'm an expert in like voice design patterns, or sometimes you see something like the new machines that you're seeing nowadays, the sensor base. So there are a lot of areas that I think this industry is going to explore. But right now, for this particular presentation, I just focus on GUI. So the common problem that I've seen when people technically design is that when they're talking about design pattern, they're mixing things up. So they're mixing the input device, they're mixing the cognitive flow, and they're mixing the process data flow and machine flow. So I think this is a very common mistake that I see. So when you tackle your design or execute your design plan, so the short answer is that you probably want to have a general idea of what users want to achieve. However, when you do a design, you really need to clearly break down this into step-by-step logic sequence. So I would even say that when you see a text box, you click the text box, and you get a response from the text box. You hit Enter key, perform a search, get a found set back. Those are really, if you analyze it, it's really just, there are really just more than probably 3 or 5 steps, I would assume. So these steps, you really have to be able to map it up front in your mind when you do design. So another thing that I want to talk about is that I personally believe that the term UX is a overrated term because it is so generic, and it tries to cover as many disciplines as possible. But in fact, UX contains a lot of different expertise. And this is why when people are talking about these different terms and you start getting confused, what exactly you're talking about, UX, different person, depends on the company you work for, he will always give you a different kind of idea of what exactly UX is, what design pattern is, what logic sequence is, what is interface design, interaction design, and you get all mixed up. So the way that I look at it is that I believe design really falls into something that is very basic, at the basic level. So this, I did not really invent this flow. So there is, if you do a Wikipedia search for flowchart, you might be able to see that this is something for industrial engineering. So there is a sequence of how humans normally interact with machines. So let me just call it out. Input device, cognitive process, human output, machine input, machine process, and machine output. So in my view, I think the heart of design, especially design for machine interaction, is really the sequence for I think this chart covers this entire sequence. And for each individual box, I think it deserves a subject of study that I think that I don't really have the depth of knowledge to cover every single of them. But this is just a general picture that I think that you should tackle interaction design. So today, what I want to do is that instead of giving you examples or solutions, what I would like to do is that I'm going to cover 3 areas that I think is worth to bring up to help you to see design instead of do design. So the reason that I say see design is that when we look at the designs, like I said, it's very easy, it's very tempting to just go into the visual representations or looking at the speed of the output. There are a lot of distractions per se that would just derail your focus to different area. But I think this areas needs to be tackled differently. So today I'm going to cover 3 areas that hopefully these tools will be able to help you to identify the design problems that you're working with. So number 1 is decision flow. You have probably seen flowchart like this before. I also did not invent this. In fact, I just learned recently this is an ISO standard. I had no idea. I've been using this flowchart for a decade, and I just simply pull these symbols out of my mind, and I've been using it for a long time. And I realized that, well, there is actually a standard for this. So this is also an example that I call design pattern. So when we're looking at this flowchart, this is, how do you say, you probably can, right now you see this and hope in the futures when you do a flowchart, then you know that actually there is a general standard that you can use. So the way that I'm tackling this problem is that whenever I'm talking about decision flow, I break it down into a very simple formula. And this is just a few examples right here, so I don't want to, there are a lot more that I did not cover here. But in most of the times when I'm tackling a design problem, these 5 components can pretty much just suit my need. So it can be a linear flow, it can be a binary decision, it's multi-way decision, it's a branch, it's repetition. So the problem about this, creating a general flowchart is that also people, when you're talking about flowchart, people get confused. Are you talking about page flow? Are you talking about data flow? Are you talking about user action flow, mental flow? So things all get mixed up. So how do you start? I would say that toward the end of the design exploration phase, normally I tend to create a flowchart that covers all of them, and I'll probably color code that which one is human input, which one is machine output, which one is page. But usually the best way to start is to start with user's intent. So what can I do? How do I make choice? Is it single or multiple? What are the available actions? What is the feedback of my actions? Do I get my expected return? If I don't, what now? So you really need to spend a little bit of time thinking about these attributes. So once you have the idea of intent, and once you the intent will naturally just extend to decision making. So when you're defining a task, then you often just say that, okay, this is my intent, I want to buy something, and during that purchase process, there are several decisions that I need to make. And during your design process, you probably want to write it down as well, so that you have very clear picture of what exactly users is trying to achieve and what exactly the decisions that user have to make. So to me, when you start with these 2 attributes, usually things get a lot more stable later on. If you don't really have a clear idea of what user's intent would be or the user's decision point, of course, there would be input devices that involve, and there would be a machine output, which is the visual presentation layer that you have to process. I think I'll talk about that a little later. So right now, I'm just focusing on the decision flow and the intent of users' tasks. So this is a more mature output that I create for most of the projects that I work on. So the advantage of doing this type of exercise is that once you have a clear intent and the decision flow, so this type of UI interface options will naturally just come out from your brain because you have used this millions of times. So of course, depends on what you use. If you're more familiar with iOS, and your brain probably just pick up the iOS design patterns that you've seen before. So for example, like my son, He is not familiar with TV UI, but he is an expert of YouTube. So YouTube is really not about control, it's all about search and relevant content. He is a lot more familiar with that, but he is not familiar with TV control. So this is also an interesting character of design patterns, is that you thought that you capture what exactly the flow that you want, and you have an idea of the control interface that you want to use to represent the flow of your task. But this control interface might vary by person. So if this whole scenarios or this flow still seem abstract to you, so let me just give you a quick shopping cart example. So when we want to buy something in the shopping cart, these are the several steps that I would think in mind. 1, make a selection. 2, build a shopping list. 3, review and make changes and identify myself, submit payment information, and confirm. Based on this flow, the way that my mind process is that through these actions and the decision points, I will naturally pick up, my mind will naturally just pop up with this, the right layers of element. Is it a list? How many of them, how many items that I want to support? Is it 3, 5, 10, 100? They're all different. Decision point, can it be loop? If I make the decision, can I make a change? If I make the decision that's binary, yes and no, and I move forward, can I come back? If I take an action, what kind of a feedback did I get? If it's a form, how many of the fields I need to collect, and how the form is being ordered. So this type of things will naturally just come up in my mind when I have a clear defined sequence of the action. So the end result somewhat look like this. So the reason that I mentioned about this particular flow is that it is linear. So a lot of problems that we're seeing in many custom apps that we're seeing, or in other websites, or in even iOS applications, the developers try to provide too many options at one time, and then your use cases kind of just go like that. So what you really want to do is to have your use case to focus on your key tasks and make the key tasks to be a very linear flow. Within this linear flow, you might have some minor decision points or some loop points that will have to force you to come back to the previous step, but keep it linear. So let me give you another example. Let's say we want to book a hotel. So when we think about hotel, what do you think of? And this is where my background of Yahoo search comes in. I think this is a very important aspect when you're tackling a design problem. So when you think about hotel, there are many attributes that connect to this hotel. So if you're talking about, I'm looking for hotel, yes, your intent is very clear. You want to look for a specific hotel, but how to start? The short answer is that you can actually start with any of this. So this is something that is really a challenge for designers or product managers, or let's say startup, you want to build a particular search engine. So the important part is that, well, for this, all this attribute, what would be the technical capabilities? What are the architectures or the data that I can use? What are the patterns that I can use? What are the other examples that are seen in other applications? And perhaps there is a better experience that you can invent that could potentially start with one of these, but maybe it could be start with something different that a lot of people never thought of. And that's the time that really makes your application unique. So the way that my brain processes is that whenever I have this task being defined and decision being defined, and I just quickly just put it into my layout and get a general sense of what would be the potential flow for the user. Top, left, right, top, down. So when I map these texts in, so that I usually have a general picture of how many options that users have to choose up front. So I'll cover this a little bit more later, but keep in mind that the most common mistake that I've seen in a lot of applications is that you have different boxes, and this different boxes does not they are not related to each other. They all try to do separate things. And that basically coming back to the TV remote problem I was talking about. You kind of know what it does, but you tend not to want to touch it because it takes a lot of time to process. So you just simply go with things that's easier to recognize, like top nav, side nav, or modules. So these are things that I talked about yesterday. All right. So after decision flow, let's talk about arrange elements. So I would like to clarify what arranging element means here. So it can be arranging a step of your flow, the logical sequence of the mental flow. It can be arranging the control interface. It could be arranging your data process. So there are many different meanings here. But here I'm just focusing on the visual side of arrangement, because the visual side of arrangement is so much tied to, so tightly connected to your tasks and your intent and decision flow. So when people are talking about visual design, so I would hope that you don't talk about pretty colors anymore. So every visual element that you see on screen, blue, red, black, white, they all serve certain functions. So this is really coming down to visual psychology, which I studied when I was back in college. It actually takes a little bit of time to really understand what works and what doesn't, but the short answer is that there are some general principles that you can find online. For example, contrast, size, positions, those things you can probably easily find examples and the principle that other designers talked about. Here, today, I want to talk about specifically around Scanline. This slide is something that I presented last year. So this is a very important starting point for your user. So when you create an application, your layout needs to suggest some kind of workflow. If you don't really suggest a workflow, basically that means you have options, a list of options. Whenever users see a list of options, the more they see is the more time is needed for them to process. So this is also an interesting example that I'm bringing back. So depending on how you arrange these elements, it actually creates a different kind of meaning. So this is just my own interpretation. So when I use the US ATM machines, I feel like I'm actually doing typing. And it might have something to do with people using calculator a lot here. I might be wrong, but I just feel like it's more like a typing experience. But in Japan, the ATM machine that I saw earlier, it feels more like speaking, because the bottom three numbers are the end of the sentence. So you go from top down, end of sentence, and hit green button, enter. So I think this is just an interesting observation to bring it. So I guess my point is that the arrangement of these elements really create a certain kind of, I call it a sentence. So when you're arranging this element, you're really constructing a sentence that directs your user from point A to point B. So when you see a layout, which is a bigger, a bigger collection of this arrangement, so you probably want to be a little bit careful, not only within a particular module per se, but in your overall layout, it should probably form some kind of sentence. So if you can articulate what that sentence is, you will be able to target the specific task and then the control component that you need to use for this task. So this is what I was talking about. The initial scanline implies a general workflow. I think this is a really important factor, is that you really need to have a clear idea of what's the user's intent and what's the relationship between the larger box and then the smaller boxes, and whether they are, for example, if you see the left one, the purple box 3, are they conceptually connected to each other? They might or they might not, or it could be a split. It can be a list that's displayed horizontally, but the light blue box is probably your area of focus. So this pattern you probably have seen in a lot of content websites. So when we're talking about layout, basic layout scan lines, honestly, my feeling is that I don't really see a lot of variations. So I'm picking up 3 examples here. Left is the master detail, which would have the navigation on the top, and then you have a sidebar, and the sidebar has a list. Whenever you click the list, and the right hand shows as you click the list items. And the parallel scan line in the middle is something you see in newsfeed, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. They all use this kind of top-down scan line because feed is, people like to say that we want user to digest. There's a term for this, I think it's called unlimited content. You just continue to scroll and then the content keeps loading. So this top-down scan line is actually optimized for that particular action. And the single page scan line, this is something very common that you see in like SaaS applications or some startup or company website. I'll talk about the right one a little bit more because it has something to do with the open source framework that people use, which I think is also an important factor that decide how this trend is going. So again, this is coming back to my notion of design patterns, because design pattern changes over time. And those patterns usually are defined by the dominant platform or the most popular one. And it actually will change as the technology improves, or let's say if iOS released some completely new design in the future, and over time you probably just adapt to the newer one and forget about the old one. So for those of you who remember the shift between iOS 6 and iOS 7, that is really a big change, like within the design community. So this is really just a common example. So visual hierarchy allows user to focus. This also has something to do with how you form your initial scan line. There is a potential tempting action that you might take is that when you break down your layout, you tend to break it down to fit whatever content you want to fit it in. And you adjust the layout and you realize that there are too many items in that box and you're running out of space. What do? My suggestion is that you really need to just quickly draw it out on the whiteboard and then make sure that you can actually count the elements inside the box. So once you have an idea of the element inside this box, and you can naturally just resize it, and based on your task, you can define that whether this box deserves a higher visual priority or lower visual priority, or you can say that I need a parallel priority compared to similar functions of this module. So size is important. Also, vertical alignment matters. So this is also the common problem that I've seen, is that we all know that when we read left, right, and we want everything to align, but when we read top down, and I realize we tend to pay less attention to vertical alignment. I think the reason is that as you start adding the elements, then you kind of just don't really have the control of this element. It just naturally extend, and I need the text to be this long. There's no way that I can change it. So in the end, and I constantly see there are, especially when you have a layout that has a lot of fields, and the fields kind of just left, right, and it actually make your scan lines really difficult to digest. So this is also one of the reasons that's why base columns are important. So I don't know, any of you have participated in some other designer sessions when they're talking about columns. In FileMaker, I remember a couple of years ago, my old boss showed the column features in FileMaker. I would suggest you to turn it on. You can actually automatically proportionally divide your layout into columns. And this would really help you to reinforce that vertical alignment. So white space is also something that a lot of people don't pay attention to. White space I used to do website designs for both the Eastern Asian market and the Western market. That was before the era of Web 2.0. I don't know if anyone is familiar with the term Web 2.0. Before that, that was the times when Yahoo was still popular. And in China, in East Asia, a lot of the websites tend to have a lot of information cramped all together. And the interesting arguments that I heard is that because there's no broadband, so what people tend to do is that they opens up multiple tabs at the same time. And they stick with one tab, and then they want as much as content to be fit in as possible, so they don't have to wait. That is a really interesting comment. And of course, things start changing as we are more adapting to the mobile environment. Things getting a little bit more, the design field also changed to more task-focused and more bigger fonts, larger objects, more concentrated use cases. So naturally, the white space become an interesting subject because white space from a visual design standpoint is contradicted, it's supporting whatever the element of focus that you want to call out. So this is also the area that you probably want to pay attention to. And especially if you relate to magazine designs or all newspaper design, you can probably see that this white space actually functions as a very important column division and also the hierarchical breakdown tool. So please keep that in mind. So linear scanline provides contextual cues. So this seems pretty obvious, but I also see some less experienced designer make this kind of a mistake. Whenever there is a contextual actions or there are something that is related together, it's actually better to group it. And also, it's better to form a vertical or horizontal scan lines to make it a simple visual flow. I always like the examples of using supermarket as example. You go to a supermarket and you see coffee, and used to be they just sell coffee, but nowadays they're not only selling coffee, they're selling coffee cups and they're selling milk. So this kind of a contextual connection to the subject of your attention starts to become a interesting areas to explore. And especially, and this is also part of the reason that I keep bringing up search, because search is really all about intent and feedbacks and contextual content based on your intent. Repetition unifies visual interest. So this is something you might also be familiar with, but just keep in mind that whenever you are creating a group of combination of objects, it is actually better to repeat it if they have similar functionalities. So this is really coming down to visual design areas, but I think this is also some mistake that I commonly see in a lot of solutions. All right, so the next thing that I want to talk about is control interface. Okay, when I talk about control interface, I have to mention that each platform is unique. So this is one of the primary reasons that I did not want this presentation to focus on FileMaker, because FileMaker is just one of the many platforms. And FileMaker, in a sense, is almost like a browser environment. The platform gives you some default control components, but you can actually build your control component on your own. Of course, there is cost associated with it. Now the question is that if I want to create a repeating component, how much cost does it take? If I create this component that is repeatable, well, if I create the component spending a few weeks creating that particular component, how much I can reuse it? And the more you reuse it, the stickier it gets. So if you start with a default component, that's good. The default component can still very much suit your need. But if you want to go beyond that, and there are multiple there are multiple factors comes in. For example, when you are, especially when you're developing the custom apps for mobile application. And last year or 2 years ago, I've been hearing customers debating about the back button. Should it be on top left corner or should it be on top right corner? Top left or top right? Left. Oh, okay, so now everyone agrees that it's left. Why is left? Because iOS is left. So this is an sort of important subject that I want to bring it up. Because a lot of these control component is really defined by the dominant platform. So when we're talking about dominant platforms, this dominant platform will actually, the behavior will gradually embedded into your mind over time. So let's say if iOS making the new change in 11, I think there are some changes coming on the control, it's called the control panel. You slide bottom up. I think there are some changes going to go there. And it used to be iOS has something called car style window that shows a list of actions right in the middle, I believe. They changed it from showing up that window from to bottom up with two buttons that's lining up together. So I guess my point is that these type of design or control interface patterns will change over time. And keep in mind that if you stick with something, make sure that you understand that something is it's a pattern that others can relate. If you're forced to create your own cognitive pattern, I'm not saying that you can. Of course you can do it, but keep in mind that the more you repeat it, the stickier it gets. So when we're talking about dominant platform, this is also an important factor that I have to bring up. Now, used to be, when I started out as a web developer, so I write HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and we can easily get clients who needs to create their custom website. And we spend a lot of time to create these fancy interactions, either using Flash or using, at the time there's no CSS3, but there are some fancy interactions happening. So we will be able to get the enough pay or enough time to be able to do that. But software industry, in my view, in the past decade, things start changing because the technology is improving so fast, and the cognitive flow also changes so fast. So when we're designing an application, it's actually better if you can shrink your development cycle shorter and shorter. And this happens to a lot of different industries, including the game industry where I used to work at. It was okay to spend 3 months just to write a 30-page design document that outlined every single details about your flows, your user actions, what will happen if you click the buttons, and so on. But now the flow, I would probably only give myself 5 hours to create the flow. And we take that 5 hours flow and run it for prototype, and prototype takes about a day to get the prototype back, run the test, doesn't work, and continue to do that iteration. And to me, that is a very important shift of approach to software development. So this is what, when the web front-end framework comes in. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with things like Bootstrap or Semantic UI or Foundation UI. So I see people nodding. So the short answer is that it's fast. You use Bootstrap, this is the default layout. You get this in 5 minutes. So you don't really have to write anything, and then you just instantly get all the control components just in one line of code, and then you can just easily access it. It's just so convenient and so fast, so customizable. So this has become almost like for a lot of my web design friends, they, not necessarily Bootstrap, but there are other design frameworks, it basically just including WordPress. Now I think no one really wants to spend a lot of time building a content management system from scratch. They use framework, they just buy something from SceneForest for $30 or $50. They put a custom CSS into it and then grab a shopping cart, integrate with different services. So this is the nature of the shift of the software industry. So the end result of this shift is that not only because the development time has been shortened, but you start to see something that repeatedly happen over and over again. And coming back to my point, when you see it a million times, you kind of just get it stuck in your mind. So is it good or bad? I can't really say is it good or bad, but from a designer standpoint, of course, we want something to be done in a more functional way, but we also want to spend time. Also want to save time. So for me, when I approach web projects, I just tend to go with design frameworks and then create my own CSS. So you might ask that, how does it apply to FileMaker? I will talk about that a little bit later. So the next thing I just covered earlier, iOS platform. When you are using FileMaker to create something that seems to be similar, that is similar to iOS native app, I think the important factor is that you really have to know what is iOS. And I would encourage you to open up Xcode if you are interested in exploring the default component that Xcode gives you. Or you can just simply do a search for the development, the UI kits that you can see on Apple's website. So those are really the fundamental building blocks that iOS provide. And the reason that I want to call this one out is that when you are building your own flow in FileMaker, there's a tendency that you probably want to try to mimic what iOS does. For a very simple reason, the more you repeat, the more sticky you get. So users don't really have to mentally process this new UI control if you invent something new. However, in FileMaker, of course, it is the platform is different. There's always a debate for the web community that how close I can make web to behave like a native environment. The short answer in my mind is never, because they are just naturally different. So the same applies to your FileMaker development process. When you're building something new, just be careful that something new might be against what iOS is trying to do. And that would actually affect your the process time from the user's perspective. Because it is just so, you're actually competing with millions of applications. So when you're inventing new rules, just be careful. So this one, I have my gut feeling, how many of you heard about this? Anyone? Oh, that's surprising. Thank you. So this is something that's pretty new. I just learned a couple months ago. So you can see that there is a need for that standard because everyone wants to try to make their own standard. So this particular website, I would encourage you to do a quick research. It actually contains a lot of very good design principles, not necessarily for the web, but mostly used for the web, but I think those design principles are pretty well executed and looks through their documentations and sees their rationales. I think these rationales are very useful in terms of applying this design philosophy or principles into your FileMaker application as well. So the idea of US web standard is that there is clearly a need from government's perspective that for all government service website, they want to have a unified language. So the goal is pretty easy to understand, but the execution part is something that I think remain to be seen. But again, please keep in mind, if you get a chance, take a look at what it is. So this is really coming back. I talked about all these different dominant platforms, the framework, and US web standard. So the short answer is that the short question is that which one is the standard? I guess the question is depending on your customers, and also depending on the platform that you want to have your applications to work with. So I remember from my early careers in different companies, each company or each individual design team, or per my knowledge, even within Apple, there's always a debate about whose design standard is standard. My design standard is standard. So, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't pay attention to this, because it's really just one way or another. It's different kind of representation of very simple decision-making points and then UI controls. So when I talked about control interface, I don't really think about standard. The standard is more toward when I start executing the design, I think about standard. But in my mind, usually this is something that comes in my mind when I design. So are you talking about inputting value, display list, making the choice, toggle, taking actions, make the decisions, and so on? So if you get a chance, I would say if you can embed this exercise for your design flow to specify this user's intent, decision point, especially when user needs to make the decision, define what kind of decision it is. And this is really the tool of the potential decisions that users can make. And you can map it and then arrange it just like jigsaw puzzles. So another topic is that do I take what's been given or build my own? The short answer is that you can do either, but maybe from user's perspective, it could be the same. I think this really needs, I can't really argue which one is really better. I think you can actually ask your user, see if they actually can see the differences, can tell the differences. If your user doesn't necessarily mind for you to create this custom control, maybe it could save your time, save a week or 2 weeks to develop this and then just simply use whatever is being given. In fact, I think in FileMaker, it already gives you a lot of good control components. And also, I have seen a lot of applications that use web viewers and have web components to be loaded inside the web viewer, which I think is also a good method. Of course, from FileMaker's perspective, we always want to continuously expand our platform to be more developer-friendly. But that is a subject that's outside of this scope. And please keep in mind that every design problem has multiple solutions. So you don't really have to get too hung up on a particular choice. I often see people arguing about choice A or choice B. A lot of them is really just the visual differences. There are, the real differences in my mind is that if you remember the chart I was talking about from the human input to machine output, the real difference is really the distance between these two. So to me, the control interface is just one aspect, but not the whole picture. Expand your user interface vocabulary. So this website is called UI Patterns. I have to say that I'm not really a huge fan for this website, but it does give you a different scenarios or different problem space. For example, they will categorize your actions as login, getting a shopping cart, or buying, or a search, or there are like forms, password strings, and so on. There are a lot of examples that you can find that help you to picture the potential use cases that you will be, or use cases or the problem space that you will be dealing with, and be prepared when you see this problem space. The more you do it, and then naturally you can just pull it out from your back of your heads. For example, for myself, I've been doing this for, I can't count how many times. So whenever I see a particular design problems, I can instantly just pull probably 4 or 5 options in my mind. So this potential option can fit into this scenario. So what I would do is that I would probably create a template in OmniGraffle or in Visio, some simple or balsamic, and I just simply arrange all these elements and do quick usability testing that way. I find it pretty useful, but the important part is that you have to always be curious or always try new things. And whenever you try new things, you realize that there are a lot of different kind of problem space popping up every day, especially the new application that you're seeing nowadays, or when you start seeing more voice-based controls, or things like Uber. I think Uber at the time last year or 2 years ago, it was, in my view, is one of the best design applications. Of course, we're not really talking about the Uber's problems nowadays, but purely from a design standpoint, I have to say that they've done a great job. So last, I want to talk about designing for multiple devices. So this is really not about CSS and media query, responsive design framework, iOS design pattern, Xcode auto layout, FileMaker auto sizing. So what I want to talk about is the specific problems that you're dealing with when you're designing for multiple devices. So yesterday, when I demoed the server admin console, I got an interesting feedback, and many of you probably will resonate to that comment. When I was saying that the column is responding to your overall window size, and I drag it toward the middle, and I stop right there, and people start laughing. So for responsive design, the short answer is that yes, for Bootstrap, if we just take Bootstrap as a framework, we can just take whatever Bootstrap gives us and then shrink it down, and boom, you get your responsive design for free. It's actually not that simple. Responsive design is not only about changing the font size and then reordering the boxes. Actually, it has a lot to do with the width of your device and the variation between all different kind of device. So the consideration is actually not only about font size or in the ordering of the box. The consideration is really about a potential interaction shift. And that interaction shift requires UI components to handle that. And building that UI component takes time. So that was my short answer. But it doesn't mean that we don't really know that's a problem. We actually have something in our back pocket that I was not able to show. But just so you know that responsive design sometimes is not as simple as 1, 2, 3, even in the web world. So in FileMaker context, because FileMaker is very much a layout-based and then a schema-based framework. So I'm not going to compare different platforms, but in FileMakers, when you're doing a layout specifically for iPads or iPhone, my recommendation is that do 2 layouts instead of 1. Maybe you can get away with 1 layout for both iPhone and iPad, but I barely see people. How many of you actually create your FileMaker applications on iPhone? Oh, that's actually more than I thought. Thank you. We'll definitely take this into consideration because I saw that the majority of our users are iPad focused. So apparently I was wrong. So when we're talking about multi-device design, viewing distance is very important. So I would just quickly walk through the slide because I'm running out of time. So the viewing distance influences the information density. I think maybe I should phrase it the other way around. The information density is a result of viewing distance. So just keep that in mind. So another thing is that design pattern vary by platform. I think this is easy to understand, but I think this is also one of the reasons that I continue to bring up about this the concept of dominant platform. Please look at Xcode, please look at iOS, because this iOS design patterns, they already have a collections of control interface, the cognitive flows, and then also the the machine process. How do you handle a list? How do you drill down a list? So iOS has already defined those elements for you. So if you can choose to build an application against that rule, but that actually create a cognitive offset for users. So again, just be careful and always pay attention to what the platform you're running, and don't build against the platform, if I may say. One column is effective for a simple reason. So I think I have covered this, the Scanline well enough that I don't really have to add more explanation for this. So keep in mind that the initial Scanline is very, very, very important for a lot of the application, also including Apple applications where there are some newer applications. There's always a tendency that, well, including the music app, I have to say that none of the music app is my favorite app. They all have the tendency that they're mixing different design patterns and then constantly shifting your visual scan lines. I just simply don't like that level of complexity. So always keep the available width in mind. So especially when you're talking about auto layout in FileMaker. So I know that FileMaker currently only supports like 2 columns stretching. And not long ago, I was hearing people debating about this 2 particular implementation. I can't say which one is better, but for people like myself who have done a lot of international websites and then also websites or applications that support multiple languages, you can easily run into this kind of problem. You can't really predict the width of an object. And the end result is that you start losing the vertical scan line because you don't really have control over this element. And it's the element that's forcing you to push your objects to destroy the vertical scan line, which I think this is something that you might want to avoid. But that being said, I'm not saying the right side is a better approach. It's just one approach that can help you to solve the unpredictable width problem. So keep in mind that when you have an object, always think about the available width and the available width for your parent container. Another thing that I want to mention is that mobile workflows are time sensitive. So this is also a very important concept. If you compare desktop applications and then mobile applications, you would know that the use cases are actually very different. For mobile, it's bite-sized. You always carry your phones, you always carry your iPad. Your attention can only last for a few seconds. So use cases, especially when we're talking about text input, I would assume that most of you probably don't prefer text input on mobile device. It's just simply because it takes more time and it doesn't really have the precision that you have on desktop. So these 2 platforms actually, they're very different because they are just different, the use cases are different in nature. So last year I was talking about this 5 W's, who, what, when, how, where, how much. So I just bring it up again so that you can keep in mind that whenever you're designing or creating your application, always keep this 6 W's in mind. And you always need to have a clear answer. So good UX, this is something that came from my last year's presentation. So I just read it quickly. Defined, it identifies a clear purpose. It's customer-centered. It provides predictable results of action. It's performance-driven and speedy. It's clean and readable. It leaves an impression. So it might seem that when I talked about design, there's a lot about science, logical sequence, and things that can be measured in a quantitative form. In fact, I think the challenge of design is that it's difficult to measure in the qualitative, in a quantitative level, and because design is an art of arrangement. So the logical sequence itself is science, but the arrangement of that logical sequence is art. So this is really there's two different areas that I think is an interesting mix, that when you're designing, one way or another is, if you're pointing one way or another, is not very good. And also when I'm participating the traditional usability study or like focus groups or all kinds of different so-called the UX research, I always find that they're always looking for the quantitative data, but not the qualitative data. So I think the qualitative data is something that really requires iterations and testings and getting your users' feedback. And it also requires curiosities and creativities for you to explore something that has never been explored before. So I'll come back to this charts, and then please keep in mind that this chart is, in my mind, how I approach design problem. I don't think about heuristic evaluations or competitive studies or UX, UCD design, even though that I bring it up, those terms. I think those are just tools, but not goals. So in my mind, this is how my mind processes. So I would tackle these individual layers and try to lay out the step as detailed as possible. And then I will arrange these steps to create something that is easier for user to digest. So last, I would just want to quickly wrap up what I talked about and then give you some examples of my observations of what examples of good UX could be. So visual cues inform decisions. So this is exactly the Japanese ATM machines example that I was talking about. So the last three buttons are 00, the thousands, and 10,000. And I find it very intuitive because it really just, I speak Japanese too, so it really just feels like speaking. Arrangement suggests the order of actions. So this is probably not a good example, but I guess you get my point. The density of information impacts the ability to learn. So this is an example that I got a lot of laughs when I present these slides in Japan last year, because this is actually a meme in Japan, because they're talking about which one is R, what is R and what is L. It's like you go to coffee shop and what is mega or what is giga, or there are some terms that is not really clearly defining. So there is no small, there is only medium and large. So there is a story behind this. So the story is that people just, the convenience store owners, they just continue to add stickers to describe how this works. But the more they add the stickers, the worse, the more confused the customers get. Color can be meaningful in different ways. So this is also, I brought this up because I want to clarify that when people say visual design, graphic design, this is very different from UX design. I hate to use this term, but that's probably the only terms that I can come out with. So colors, pretty colors is different from one color being surrounded by a mix of same colors together. So it's really just coming back to what I was talking about, the visual psychologies of comparison, sizings, and the warm colors, emotional effect, the cold colors, emotional effect. There are all kinds of different attributes. So if you're interested in the subject, there are tons of books that you can read. But just keep in mind that next time you go to gas stations and you see colors, and different gas stations handle color differently, and they means differently. So keep that in mind when you design your application too. And I have a tendency, there's designers that keep telling me that I have a tendency to just continue to remove color. And I always go with something that is grayish. From my perspective, I like that because when I was in agency environment, advertising agency, we put a bunch of images and it's very colorful UI, and you start losing the sense of functionalities, and it becomes harder to process. So there is a tendency that I just use one color for call to actions. So when you're introducing new colors, yes, you can, but be careful that these new colors might contradict or might conflict to other colors that you might have because they produce different meanings. So this one is easy. Speed is the king. So I remember a long time ago, people were talking about my teacher back in my school. He's a designer for the New York subway, the Metro card purchase machine. So he actually brought this up, and he showcased his thought process of how he designed that subway machine. When we talked about design problem, we tend to try to solve the technical problems about how to make the purchase process faster. But as we try to chase that improvement, there's something that's new come out, that you don't actually need the machine anymore. So now if you go to China, I don't know, you probably heard the story that in China, they now use payment on their phones. So the payment system generate a QR code. Whenever you go, you just scan your QR codes, and then boom, it's done. So the China generations, young generations, they skip from cash. They skip the credit card. They go from cash directly go to the mobile device for a simple reason, because it's fast, it's easy. So that's all I have to show today. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and please feel free to talk to me if you have any questions. Fill up the forms, and I hope that, because I'm not really a native speaker, so if there's any glitches, my apology. All right.